Hey everybody, welcome to Good Shepherd Lutheran Church. It's Pastor Jamie Benoit. As always, I'm glad you can be with us, and I hope that today's time in the text is meaningful for you. Today, text for Wednesday, September 30th, but today we're going back a little bit in the Bible to the Old Testament. We're going to read from the book of Judges. Our text comes to us from the book of Judges, the 16th chapter, verses 23 to 31. And this is where we hear of Samson's death. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. When the people saw him, they praised their God, and they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hand, the wrath of our country, who has killed many of us." And when their hearts were merry, they said, "Call Samson, and let him entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. They made him stand between the pillars, and Samson said to the attendant who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which this house rests, so that I may lean against them." Now when the house was full of men and women, all the lords of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson performed. Then Samson called to and said, "Lord God, remember me and strengthen me only this once, O God, so that with this two middle pillars on which the house rested," and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Then Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." He strained with all his might, and the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So those he killed at his death were more than those who he had killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel for 20 years. Here ends our reading. Now it's interesting, when I heard the story of Samson at the time, I was watching the political debates last night as well as I was figuring out what to say today, which is another commentary in and of itself. Story. And it's about when Abraham Lincoln was an attorney. He had a gentleman come to him and want to file a suit and take to court a debtor who owed this person $2.50. Abraham Lincoln begged and pleaded with this man not to do it, but the man insisted that he wanted his revenge, and so he wanted to take this gentleman to court. So Abraham Lincoln charged the man who was hiring him to take this other man, the debtor, to court, $10 in court fees. He won. He gave half of that money to the person they had just filed suit against, who owed the $5. He gave half of his 10 to him, so he gave him $5. The man paid $2.50 back to the other gentleman, and the guy who wanted the court case and insisted upon it seemed to be happy with the whole situation. His revenge of wanting to just get back, he essentially just paid himself back the money, is what it amounted to. But he was so set and sort of laser focused on the revenge of getting back that money that he was okay with how it proceeded. I just thought that was amazing. It kind of made me chuckle because it reminded me that revenge is an interesting emotion. It can make you blind of everything else that is going on around you. It's probably as powerful to us in our human nature as love is, because love and revenge sometimes goes as far as hatred, can make us completely blind to all the destruction that's going on around us. I mean, when I was growing up in Sunday school, I mostly heard of Samson explained as a hero of sorts, replete with the standard dose of machismo and aggression and goodwill. And then, of course, he had this consecrated, physicality in which he was unapologetic in his hoopta, in his and in his flair. His story is proof positive his story is proof positive that it is in Christian canon, that it's simply not true, that ultimately it's not how you begin, but it's how you end. And with God on your side and in your quarter, and as your sustenance, all things are possible. And that is true. I mean, in life's fourth quarter, uh, when defeat seems like it's going to be imminent, God can still redeem us. God can secure victory and even retribution in his name. And all of this is on point. But with Samson, just like with you and me, there's always another side of the story. Excuse me. Through Samson, though Samson was a holy man, he was separated from God's distinct use. He was also very impulsive. He was reactive. He was defiant. There's no getting around any of that. He was dripping wet with rebellion, and on account of being strong and so reactive and tempered, it's no wonder that nobody ever kind of pulled him aside and was like, "Dude, I think you might be going a little far." Um, to lovingly tell him about himself. Sure, he'd had, maybe a situation here or there. Where during that time he'd been took or he'd been hoodwinked or bamboozled, led astray, or even just ran amok on his own accord. But we read, in chapter 14 with his marriage to a Philistine woman, but he brought that drama on himself. And that's what happens when you do sort of whatever you want because you're big and bad enough to do it. So when we pick up the story today, Samson's in prison. Samson's had his eyes taken out. He's been humiliated before the Philistines. Samson, excuse me, I keep yawning. I'm sorry. Samson was the sport for their drunken entertainment, whatever that may have looked like. Then this man of God, this judge who led Israel for 20 years, put his hands against two pillars in this pagan temple and brought it down upon all the Philistines that were gathered and upon himself. But the question still kind of always, makes you wonder, how did Samson get in this predicament? I mean, it wasn't his birth. Some people excuse their actions by saying, I didn't have a chance from the beginning. I was born into poverty and despair. I was just another nobody from a long line of nobodies. Born to lose. That's what some say about their lives, but Samson couldn't say that. Earlier in Judges, it indicated that Samson was set apart by God from his birth, and his parents, excuse me, his parents provided everything that he could possibly need to live in the effectiveness of God. So again, it makes you ask, how did Samson get here? How did he get in this predicament? It wasn't by his lack of ability. I mean, some people explain their actions and are whining a little and say, "I've always just had one sort of talent, you know, of a person. Everybody else has brains and talents, but I'm just incomplete from the beginning." It wasn't the absence of God either. I mean, some people explain their actions by complaining, God just never cared about me. I'd pray and seek God's favor and seek God's face, but I never saw any evidence of God in my life. I just couldn't do it on my own. That's what my problem was. People have all kinds of reasons, but H.G. Wells called God a very absent help in the time of trouble. And that's what some people say about our lives, that God is never there when we needed him. But you know what? Samson couldn't say that. From the moment of his conception, Samson was set apart and marked by God. Samson had this remarkable beginning in a family which loved him and dedicated him to God. So it was not because of his birth or his lack of abilities or the absence of God in his life, but it was because of the choices that he made. Or should I say, the bad choices. Samson chose to marry a Philistine woman instead of choosing a wife who was among his own people. And again, I'm not saying I'm against that. I'm just saying that as part of the story, it was told. And because then she later went on to betray him and he left her. So that was probably a bad choice. And Samson chose to get revenge on all the Philistines by burning up their fields and killing many of its warriors and stirring up this unquenchable hatred for him among the other Philistines. That probably didn't help in the situation we found him in. And Samson fell in love with a beautiful and deceitful woman, Delilah, who immediately cut a deal with the Philistines to help them capture Samson. She persuaded him to tell her the secret of his strength, and then she cut off his hair, and the Philistines took him into captivity. Probably safe to say another bad choice. Again, good circumstances and outstanding abilities and the presence of God in our lives can neutralize in an instant by our improper choices that we make. It happened to Samson, and it happens to us over and over and over again. Because the longer I live, the more I'm convinced that the essence of life, the single factor which determines the quality of our lives, is our choices. For the simple fact that life, written clearly in the story of Samson and written in between the lines of the stories of our lives, is that choices have consequences. Dr. Pierce Harris was a longtime pastor of First Methodist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. And he went to spoke at a state penitentiary one day. And he was introduced by one of the inmates who was a prisoner. In that introduction, the inmates say, "I want to tell you a story about two boys. They lived in the same neighborhood. They went to the same school. They played together. They went to the same church. And one of the boys decided that he would be smart, and so he rebelled against his parents. He quit going to church. He did what he wanted to do instead of what was right. The other boy continued to go to church and do what was right and to treat other people with love. These two boys are now grown men, and both of them are here with you today. The boy who continued down the right path and remained faithful to do the things that he was supposed to do and was taught, he is the great minister who is going to preach to us today. The boy who decided to be smart and rebelled is the prisoner who is introducing our preacher today. Two boys, same neighborhood, same school, same church, yet two diverse destinations, because choices have consequences. We have the freedom in making our choices. Nobody's going to dispute that. However, we are not free to choose the consequences of our choices. They're built right into the consequences themselves. Therefore, we need to choose carefully. We need to seek wise counsel in making key decisions in our lives. And most of all, we need to choose from the perspective of the long view. Because again, we are free of making our own choices, but we are not free to choose the consequences of those choices we make. Well, that's what I have for everybody this week. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you come back and join us again next week as we gather again around Word. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other.